Last month, American entrepreneur Dan Price resigned from his company, Gravity Payments, one day before a New York Times report came out showing that he had an alleged pattern of abusing women. Price made the news in 2015 when it was announced that his company would begin paying all employees, a minimum of $70,000 a year, and that he would take a pay cut, arguing that bosses needed to give their employees a fair deal. But as it turned out, Bloomberg reported Price has been accused of physical abuse by his ex-wife and was also being sued by his brother.
In a new article, editor-in-chief of Current Affairs, Nathan Robinson, writes, Price had been paying himself far more than was standard for similarly sized companies, earning $1.1 million a year, and the lawsuit had been initiated before the raises. This raised the possibility that Price's company-wide raises were a way of deflecting attention from his own exorbitant salary. Robinson asked the question, if the only moral CEO is an abusive narcissist, what does that say about capitalism? And here with us now to discuss is Nathan J. Robinson. Welcome.
Hey, nice to be with you.
So for people who aren't really following Dan Price, many folks on the left really celebrated the idea that he provided what he felt like was a kind of moral income for all of his employees across the board. And the story as it's told is that he basically had an encounter with an employee, I believe in the parking lot of his building, who was grumpy and disgruntled and seemed to give him in the evil eye. And when he asked him what was wrong, he said that he basically wasn't being paid enough, or that, I don't remember the gender, that they weren't being paid enough to do the job that they were doing. And he had a real come to Jesus moment and realized that he could take a lot less and give his employees a lot more. And he's been doing the circuit talking about how it has increased his company's productivity. They've earned more money. There's less turnover, all of these wonderful downstream effects, and really been advocating for people to raise their employee salaries, something that the left loves. So this is a real hit to many people, not against capitalism, but against the idea of a more progressive workplace. Why did you choose to frame the article the way that you've chosen to, Nathan?
He not only had a come to Jesus moment, he had a become Jesus moment. He started to make himself, to style himself to look like Jesus. There's these sort of photo shoot where he's walking on water.
Oh, wow.
So you got to be suspicious of CEOs generally. My leftist stance, right, is that we should be very, very careful when CEOs present themselves as the savior of the workers, because they have a lot of bad incentives. And it turns out that in this case, Dan Price, it appears from the reporting that has come out, was telling kind of a fable here. It looks as if, now we don't have confirmation that, it looks as if the $70,000, all the big raises, may have been part of an effort to deflect attention from the fact that he was being paid an exorbitant amount and was being sued for enriching himself. So, which kind of makes sense, as I say, CEOs, I tend not to trust them, and one reason for that is because I believe that power tends to corrupt, and that people who are in a position where they're making lots and lots of money and have been for years, there is something suspect if all of a sudden they have this moral revelation that they ought to pay their workers a decent salary. So I didn't trust him from the beginning. Now, it turns out that he has all these other, it's not just that he made up stuff about the raises, and he staged an incident apparently where his employees supposedly bought him a Tesla as a way of saying thank you, but he had suggested the whole thing. But it turns out that he has also been accused by many women, New York Times talked to a dozen women, of abuse. Now, you could say this is all a spectacular coincidence. It says nothing about capitalism, but it's interesting that he was presented by Nicholas Kristof, among others, as proof that capitalism could have a heart. And if that's the proof, well, the proof that capitalism could have a heart has just disappeared into thin air.
But see, I would have never fallen for this framing. I would have said, yes, this is obviously a cynical attempt, the effort to be like, oh, look, I'm one of the good ones, I care about people, etc., is obviously going to be an attempt to disguise something. I guess I don't know, from my perspective, it's not really an indictment of capitalism necessarily that this guy was looks like a kind of obnoxious creep, right? But people, especially the alleged harassment or cruelty to women. I mean, that's been a component of like capitalism is a 300-year-old system. This has been a component of everything.
With Robbie on that one to an extent. I mean, there is, unfortunately, regrettably, there are instances of misogynistic abuses, Me Too abuses across the board of people of all kinds of political stripes. And often we have seen a disproportionate valuing or believing of women depending on the politics of the person involved. So you saw broad ignoring of the claims against Joe Biden, for instance, because it was politically inconvenient. When you saw the same people very focused on the accusations that have been made against Donald Trump, you've seen any number of progressives taken down by Me Too accusations, many of which ultimately were not substantiated. And I wonder, Nathan, do you have any skepticism about whether or not that any of us should really weigh in or opine on things we don't know about the credibility of these claims, but do you wonder if there is a selective emphasis on this story at this point because of the kind of shot through the heart that Price's approach to corporate governance is to the way that CEOs typically run their businesses?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what unites all of those cases, right, is that these men have unaccountable power. There's a reason that these allegations often don't come out for years, and it's because in Price's case, he was able to legally threaten the University of Kentucky against releasing a video of his wife making accusations against him. I mean, I think the real story here is about the way that people with a great deal of power can get away with lies and manipulation and abuse. I think it's kind of funny that none of us are really surprised. Robbie's not surprised, even though he's a big proponent of capitalism, that a CEO would not be benevolent. And the question, I think, is why? Why was it so implausible that a CEO would pay their workers a decent wage? And I think we know, which is that CEOs tend to be pretty selfish and greedy people. And so when it comes out that they supposedly are not selfish and greedy people, we should look upon that story. But I think that suggests that Robbie may on some level share the deep cynicism about the capitalist system that Brianna Joy Gray and I have.
I do not. Well, but no, I would say, he's been, this publicity for what he's been up to has now forced him from this position. I mean, if he was a senator, he might be defiantly running for re-election. If he was a police chief, he might be suspended with pay. I mean, there's a lot of. I look in a very purely philosophical sense. Of course, who could argue against the notion that power does tend to corrupt, and so then it's an argument about which systems create incentives to discipline people who use power in corrupt ways, and no system is perfect, and that includes the capitalistic system. But I mean, it's belated, but I see accountability here that I think might not have occurred in other arrangements that I'm not sure you might like better or Brianna might like better.
Well, Nathan, what are those arrangements? I mean, you've written a book about, called, why you should be a socialist. How do you imagine companies, organizations to be structured differently that would allow employees to have more accountability?
Well, one of the allegations about Dan Price was that he used to haul employees into meetings, just hold a meeting just to berate an employee, right? And so the question is, well, how do we address that kind of misuse of power? And we have answers to that, right? Which is structures of workplace democracy, right? If you have a union contract, you can point to the contract and you can tell your boss to get lost if they do something in violation of the contract. Right? If you have collective ownership of an organization, there are many different models that you can structure an organization by, but each one of them is designed to make sure that if the person at the top making the decisions makes decisions that are abusive, that violate employees' rights, that they have some kind of mechanism of redress. Now, in this case, we got lucky because Dan Price had splashed himself all through the news. So, the mechanism of redress was the press. But in most small workplaces, that's not going to be an option, right? If your boss is being cruel, if he's sexually harassing people, there's often not much you can do, because if you complain about it, you can get fired. So the question is, how do we make sure that bosses can't get away with abusive behavior? And I don't think there's any answer to that question other than increasing the power of workers within the workplace, the most obvious mechanism for which is to give them a union.
So you mentioned workplace ownership, and I did want to stay on that point just for a second, because so often I think the characterization of socialism is state ownership, which I think does play a role, especially when you look at some of these larger institutions like oil refineries, et cetera. And we see the model in Scandinavia of how state ownership of those has been able to yield to a lot of benefits for the public. In Alaska, they have the oil dividend and things like that. But often under discussed is the extent to which I think the bulk of the transition that people are hoping for is greater employee ownership and employees having the ability to weigh in on decisions like whether or not a company should be moved overseas for a fraction of a dollar more in profit, or whether or not it benefits them personally, their families, their communities, to keep things at home. Can you talk a little bit about how that works?
Yeah. People make a big mistake when they think socialism is about government or the state. If you go back to the writings of socialists, what we're mainly concerned with is class. The inequality of having a certain number of people, a small capitalist class that owns, and a very much larger number of workers who sell their labor. And so decreasing the gap in power between those classes, in this case between Dan Price and the people who worked for him. Now, you can do that sometimes through the state, but the state could be a monarchy, in which case having the state ownership is not going to eliminate the class system. You can have a class system in a place where in an authoritarian system, as is noted. That's why authoritarian systems that call themselves socialist aren't socialist, because they still have a class system. So the thing you always have to look at is, who has the power? Is there an owning class and a working class? And so you can redress that in different ways. And one way is to have worker ownership. Something that gets you a little closer to it is having unions that can at least discipline the owning class. But in every case, what you're trying to do is make sure that ordinary working people have more power, because as we can see, and this is also why Rush Limbaugh called the $70,000 experiment socialism. Because Rush Limbaugh, it sounds crazy when he says, it's a voluntary, it's in the market. Dan Price is not violating the free market. But what Dan Price did do in that experiment, supposedly, it was kind of a fraud, was to decrease the gap between the owners and the workers, and to give almost a sense of worker ownership if it wasn't real. And that terrified a lot of business owners, because they thought, they really complained about what Dan Price said, because they said, he's going to set a bad example. Now everyone's going to believe in egalitarianism. So, but that egalitarianism between the owners and the workers, that's what's more important to socialism than the question of government or the private sector.
Well, I'm glad we've continued the time-honored tradition of me responding to an accusation against capitalism, saying, well, that's not really what I mean by capitalism, that's not real capitalism. People of your ideological bent responding to a criticism of socialism, saying, of course that's not socialism, that's not what we mean by socialism. So I hope to do that again at a future date. Thank you so much for joining us, Nathan.
Let's keep it going.
More Rising right after this.